let's make sure our technicals are all correct before we get going. Gonna have a great show today. I'll tell you, this is gonna be awesome. I know you guys like everybody. Okay, Gosney, promoting your books, doing all this stuff. But today we have a special expert class edition, right? So let's just make sure we're good to go here on all of our channels. So if we're good, say hi over on Rumble. We got to make sure Rumble. I think Twitter's up and I think YouTube is up. But would you all give me the thumbs up if we're good? Let me see here. Hold on. I just got to confirm with my own bloody eyes. Okay. Oh, how do we do this? so technical here. Live stream. Ah, yes. Looks like we're good. Yes, we're good. Okay, well, I can see over here on YouTube. And how about Rumble? Are we up on Rumble? How are you doing on Rumble? Matt, you there? Give me a thumbs up, Rumble, so we can go. Good. I think we are. Okay, well, I want to introduce you. I'm going to introduce you to a really cool guy that I met on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn, and there's so much garbage on LinkedIn, and so many people don't know what they're talking about. But something perked my eyes up. I said, this is somebody who's a fair person who knows what he's talking about on an area that I want to learn more about. So I said, why not invite him on our channel? And who do we have? But Shane Turnidge, right?
That's correct.
From Canada, who is a fingerprint expert. So introduce yourself for the Rumblers and YouTubers and Twits.
I'm Shane Turnidge. I'm a fingerprint examiner from Canada. I worked for police organizations, Toronto Police Service, the Pure Original Police Service. I've been an active fingerprint examiner since 1990.
Wow. Now, there's a couple ways we can go with this, and I have a little agenda. But the first thing, before we get into that, we were talking a little bit beforehand, and I see you've got some guitar cases behind you.
Oh, yeah.
And you saw some of the guitars behind me, and we were doing a little musical bonding. And I guess you're a Triumph fanboy, the trio from Toronto.
I really am. I love their blues-influenced rock and roll. It's fantastic.
Excellent. So you're a fellow music fan, and you said you have connections to the band Helix.
I do. My brother-in-law is the bass player for the band Helix, Daryl Gray. Big shout out for you.
Good job. All right. So rock on. Check out Helix. And look, I'm trying to get more techie. So first thing is we've got our little banner. So I might as well put that up. So that way I don't have to promote. Now it's just automated promotion and we can talk. All right. So now, Shane, you are a fingerprint examiner. Now, let's talk about what that is. This is called latent fingerprint examination. Explain to the folks explain to everybody, what is latent fingerprint examination?
So a latent fingerprint examination, a latent fingerprint is typically a latent fingerprint that's been developed by a scene of crime officer. And they may be one and the same person, depending on where you are. But the person will go to a scene of a crime and he may develop evidence at a scene or perhaps on evidence related to the scene. And he may have to use a certain visualization technique to make that fingerprint visible. But when they do make that fingerprint visible, the next question is, well, who does it belong to? And that's where the latent fingerprint examiner comes in. There's a process that's supposed to be followed. And it's a process known as ACE-V, analyze, compare, evaluate, and then verify. So it's a 4-step process, but not a lot of people understand that ACE-V as a fingerprint examination process is not always the way it was done. In fact, we've gone through 3 major iterations of fingerprint examination methodology, certainly in my lifetime. Once upon a time, it was all about points. You looked at fingerprint points of comparison. You showed
that's the traditional model that most people are aware of, right?
Right.
And they put them next and they say, well, 13 loops here match 13 loops over here. Therefore, it's a match. And
It became a static, in fact, it was purely dogmatic. So they were looking for three major features. They were looking for ridge endings. They were looking for bifurcating ridges, ridges that split to become two ridges, or ridges that merge to become one ridge. And then they were looking for robust ridge dots, mature features. And the reason they looked at those features is because they've been widely stated to be the most reliable features in fingerprints. And indeed they are.
well, and I mean, I'm going to interrupt you a lot because I got so many questions. I'm so excited to have you on because when people know me, I am a major critic of tool mark matching in that they think that they can match a bullet and a bullet casing to a particular firearm. Now, there's a lot of forensics that can be done with firearms. Like you can say, this is a 38 caliber bullet. That's consistent with being fired with this firearm.
Mm-hmm.
So that's junk science as far as I'm concerned. And I've talked and ranted and raved on this on a number of occasions, basically from the report, which is the President's Council of Advisors on Scientific and Technology, which is PCAST, which we're going to talk about. But and then of course the gold standard is considered DNA. So between junk science and DNA, we have fingerprints. Now it's somewhere in the middle there. So before we get too far about the history, I do want you to because I know the answers to the questions. So you are being tested here. What are, at the current state of technology, what is the current error rate for fingerprint matching?
Depends who you ask, and depends which study you want to believe, and depends on the data that they used to determine that. There've been black box studies. There's some in Florida, actually,
right, Miami.
In Miami, and you know they say that it's somewhere in the 1 to 4% false positive department, depending on which study you're sort of leaning towards.
Right. Well, here I have those black. There's a black box studies and there's white box studies, and there's a number of studies. There is some academic studies towards fingerprints, and the larger study in 2011 was 1 in 306, which is pretty good. I mean, I must say that's pretty good. That was the other, which is Miami-Dade, was 1 in 18, right, which is not so great.
That's right.
But it's still pretty good. But most people would not expect an error rate of 1 in 18.
I think there's a lot of reasons that is in fact the case.
Let's walk me through some of the reasoning.
Well, the science evolves, the science changes, and it doesn't change slightly, it changes significantly. Like I talked about before, the fingerprint examination process used to rely on points. And so once you hit that magic number, the dogma, say 12 points, you could say, you know, that this fingerprint was identified. And then about 1988, 1990, a new methodology came down the pipe, known as ridgeology. And it was a book written by a guy named David Ashbaugh, who was a sergeant with the RCMP at the time. He advocated using some of the finer, minute details in a fingerprint to use them in you know, to pursue criminal identifications. And law enforcement bought into that hook, line, and sinker. They dispensed with the old training and the old dogma training, and now we entered a new phase. The new phase was no longer, they sort of hung their hat on the 1973 Israeli declaration that there was no set number of points required for an identification. And they said, well, now it's come down to, you look at the print holistically. When you believe it is, you believe you've arrived at a conclusion, that's the end of it. The problem with that is the data went out the window. And so now it just came down to belief and opinion.
Well, okay, but let's talk about that, because that's exactly what you said on the LinkedIn that got me so intrigued, because you said anybody who says this is objective. What was I forget, how did you term that? That was one. It created a little bit of a dust up on LinkedIn, but I was like, here's a guy who's a fair guy. So what did you say about it?
Well, there's nothing about the actual nuts and bolts of the process that is actually objective.
Right.
And it's systemic in law enforcement to actually, a lot of people that are in the law enforcement, on the law enforcement side of the coin, that do fingerprint examination, they want to lean into the idea that being objective is going to get me a conviction.
Right.
And
Exactly.
leaning into an objective. If I can say something is objective, it means it's more valuable. Therefore, I can hammer this guy.
And I will
But
say that I don't think that being that honest, for one thing, I think your credibility goes way up.
I agree.
Second is it puts it in context of fairness, and it puts it in, because I mean, it is a subjective process, but if people know my first book here, and I'm going to bring it out, Ideas and Answers in Law, and there's a chapter in this book that I wrote with Dr. Oh my goodness. Another co-author, and it was talking about facial recognition software and facial examiners and people that do photo lineups and professional face matchers, right? And in that chapter, this is what's an interesting difference between fingerprint examination that I do in my research. People do not get better with training on facial recognition. And so that's fascinating, right? But now it's the opposite in fingerprint examination. Training and experience and scientific rigor and process is very much connected to validity of fingerprint analysis. Would you talk about that?
Absolutely. In the mid 90s, when that big change occurred, where opinion and belief became the standard, the problem for examiners at that time was, how do you testify to what you did when you didn't properly record it? You were called to court 2 years, 3 years after the fact. You saw the confidence of fingerprint examiners absolutely tank. In fact, we used to get people coming back from the college that were like deer in the headlights. They had no idea what they were doing. They were scared to engage. They just did not understand how they could be confident about saying something that they actually didn't really even believe themselves.
Well, what is it that they were being? But see, here's where it comes as a defense counsel and a defense lawyer, and as a prosecutor. I will say, when I was prosecuting, I wanted my client or my experts to be brutally honest. And if you say, okay, my opinion is that this fingerprint was laid by this person, and I have a relatively high confidence level. And the error rates for this are at worst 1 in 18, maybe as high as 1 in 300. Those are the sciences. Here's the process that I went through. Here's the academy. Here's the training. Here's why we check it. Here's the scientific validity. To me, that gives you credibility. You're not just saying this is proof beyond a reasonable doubt because science says he did it. You're instead laying all your cards on the table and being upfront about it. But now, how does that contrast with your experience of what people want to see happen?
So in the belief model, the problem was that people couldn't demonstrate what they did. So I always liken this to, your grade 4 math teacher. She didn't really care that 6 times 5 equals 30. She wanted you to show your work. How did you get 6 times 5 equals 30? In fingerprint examination is not different. Where that specific group of examiners has difficulty is in trying to demonstrate how they can't demonstrate their work because, number one, they didn't record it. It was, and if they did record it, it was a few cheesy lines in a memo book somewhere, which really mean virtually nothing to anybody. The problem has always been about value. All right. So how do you value a fingerprint, right? How do you value a bunch of squiggly lines that someone found on a beer bottle? Well, there's 3 different classes of fingerprint information. And this is where a lot of examiners kind of get a little messed up. Level 1 detail, level 2, level 3 detail. Level 1 detail is actually the pattern, the ridge flow. All right. The actual shape that the fingerprint might make or may not make. It may just be straight lines in the case of a palm print. What is the value of that? Well, once upon a time, fingerprint examiners used to classify fingerprints. And because prior to computers, We had manually classified collections,
Right.
and you were sitting in front of a tray, just like baseball cards or hockey cards, and going, need them, got them. Just flipping through the cards, trying to find your matching, potentially matching
amazing
donor.
that actually worked. I mean, actually,
did.
of all the sciences that could be incredibly impacted by computerization, fingerprint analysis seems to be like number one.
Well, it's up there.
Yeah.
So when the world of APHIS came to be, and that's when I first started as an examiner. Toronto invested in some very big time technology. At the time, it was considered almost AI. That tells you how far down the pipe it was. It was running on a mini mainframe. All of a sudden, the values associated with level 1 detail started to become not understood, because it was no longer relevant in the minds of police colleges to be able to teach the value associated with patterns. And the RCMP back in the day used to compile data on pattern allocations between the 10 digits. And so certain patterns appear in certain digits more often than others. Some patterns are extraordinarily rare. Some patterns are extraordinarily common. And the relationships of the focal points on those patterns can be a big decider in trying to ascertain some sense of value for level 1 detail. So the next generation comes in, and we're all focusing on level 2 detail. Level 2 detail are robust ridge features, ridge endings, bifurcating ridges, and ridge dots, essentially, or combinations of those features. These ones are reliable, they're persistent, they're always going to reproduce. They have a solid reproducibility, level. And it's what many of the statistical analyses and statistical probabilistic, tables were developed for. In fact, the fingerprint source book put out by the NIJ lists maybe about 20 of those studies, and each are flawed because they focus on certain aspects.
Well, we'll talk about some of the scientific studies in a little bit, but
they each are flawed.
The third one.
But I think what's important is, on a heuristic level, they all tell you the same thing, that the likelihood that someone's going to have 12 points of comparison in 2 different people is extremely low.
Well, but let's take a step back before we get to the analysis part. Mm-hmm. And that is something you touched on. And I was looking at it here. It's Dr. Brian Cutler is my co-author with this. Dr. Cutler is an expert on eyewitness identification. I think he's from Canada too, actually, but he's out now he's in California now. But Brian Cutler is a brilliant man. I've actually interviewed him, and I wrote an article with him. And in that, this is facial recognition. It's on page 115 for people following home at Ideas and Answers in Law. And one of the objects, one of the problems with facial recognition is quality of the sample. And so a lot of times you'll get these cameras and it's fuzzy. You've seen the security cameras. It's amazing how bad they are. And even there's bad faces. So your source material is bad. Now, I know that's also a problem in fingerprint analysis, is that
it is. How
do you get, is it good? And how does that impact the reliability of your fingerprint analysis?
Massively is a nice way to put it. In that second generation of examiners, in the first generation of examiners, quality wasn't an issue. In fact, quality was kind of an afterthought. You got your 12 points, you're good. In the second generation of examiners, the Ashbaugh methodology, the ridgeology, the ridgeologists, as they're sometimes called, they are supposed to be looking at data that is qualitative and quantitative within fingerprints. The problem with that was there was never any attempt to help examiners understand what the value of quality was and what the value of quantity was. Does every feature get a point? Does every feature worth 1? Is every, regardless of the quality? That was the problem. And so you look at 2 examiners and you give them a murky fingerprint and you ask them to annotate that particular data that's in that fingerprint, you'll get 2 totally different responses. You might see one examiner might tell you there's 16 points in there. Another examiner might not even like to use the word points, because for a while there, that was the thinking. Don't try and get people off of this points stuff, because
Right.
that's where they were, and they're trying to show where they're going. But in doing so, they had there was nothing that they could use and demonstrate and show their work. This is where I applied the value in this particular print. And that's where the fail happened, because now all of a sudden it was left to the person, and it came down to belief and opinion.
Well, and one of those factors, well, I'm going to bring this up early and often, because I preloaded this, because most people have a very glittery-eyed view, pixie dust view of fingerprints, and fingerprints can be great, but there are limitations.
Yep.
And there's a case of a fellow named Brandon Mayfield. Tell me about Brandon Mayfield.
Well, the chronology on the Brandon Mayfield case is actually horrible. And I've actually made some notes. If you don't mind, I'm going to refer to them, because I think it's worth repeating. I saved a presentation done by a gentleman by the name of Greg Soltis. Greg Soltis used to be the head of the FBI latent print section in whatchamacallit.
Of course, we always trust the FBI here in Defense Land,
just like I trust the RCMP.
Right.
And I'll give you this is what happened. So
yeah, give the consumers here a little understanding of how the Brandon Mayfield went down and how that's affected fingerprint analysis.
Absolutely. So March 11th, 2004, terrorists bombed several trains in Madrid, Spain. And in that, of course, unfortunately, there was 190 odd people that lost their lives and over 2,000 people that were injured. On March 13th, the latent print unit of the FBI receives an electronic transmission of digital images. No info, no scale. There were 8 latent prints sent by the Spanish National Police. And then there were some known exemplars sent as well. And that means people that they kind of had in mind. On March 19th, the latent print unit identifies and verifies one latent fingerprint as a result of an automated search. Means AFIS. Okay, so they use the AFIS to actually find this potentially matching candidate, but they actually identified and they had it verified. All right, using what they said was the process at the time. Well, on April 13th,
didn't they say on March 20th, they said Brandon Mayfield's, the FBI concluded that the fingerprints were a 100% match.
Yep.
So there's our FBI at work.
So the FBI in 2004, I'm going to be fair, and that's exactly what happened. But they flew over to Spain, and they had a meeting with the Spanish National Police, and they showed the Spanish National Police the matching print, allegedly, of Brandon Mayfield's, and the Spanish National Police essentially issues a negativo report regarding the latent print, and of course it flustered the FBI legal attaches. So they flew back across the Atlantic, and they had a powwow, and they flew back over the Atlantic and tried to reassert themselves and say, no, this is him. All right. They also said no, came back. They were going to fly over again. And the Spanish said, well, guess what? We've identified the print to a man named Daoud, who was, interestingly, an Algerian national. So, I mean, when you look at it from a holistic, you're in Spain, a Muslim lawyer from Oregon identified to a print on a bag of detonators associated with the Spanish train bombing. And Daoud is an Algerian national, which is essentially across the Mediterranean.
So basically the 100% match that the FBI said was utter confidence was actually not a match. It was actually not the guy. It was a false identification. And I think that Judge Ann Aiken's decision, and she said that the information was largely fabricated and concocted by the FBI and the Department of Justice.
Well, they kicked into the how do we do damage limitation. And they found a number of ways to do that. They were looking for people that were apologists, so they gathered an international or group of people, high-ranking people from various places around the world, and essentially they all got together and sort of said, yeah, it was a mistake. It was the person made a mistake. But it wasn't the FBI. They didn't do anything wrong. The procedure wasn't followed. And so all of a sudden, believe it or not, as tough as that may sound for your listeners, the reality is in a lot of places around the world, and indeed in my own country, certainly in Scotland and places with similar British legal systems, that would have never seen the light of day. But the FBI did fall on the sword, and
well, and
a lot of things happen.
This is the thing. A bad case like this, it could go one of two ways. See, it could be just the ring, like you're saying, circle the wagons, which there is some of that, but there can also be a reform of the science, because there is some scientific validity here, and there is some forensic value here that can be extracted. There's a lot of value in this. Now, I will say the same report, which was the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, which was 2016, that report, when it talked about, for instance, bite mark evidence, not only did it say that is complete fraudulent BS, it can't be done, there's no science behind it. Not only did they say that, they also said, and we shouldn't spend one more penny pursuing any kind, trying to make it good, because it can't be made good. Now, on the other hand, fingerprint analysis, they had some criticisms in this report of fingerprint analysis, but I think they were good, valid criticisms. And I think that they were saying, no, the solution here is to invest in black box studies, invest in double-blind testing, invest in training, invest in openness of the process. And so a lot of these reforms have been, I think, very positive. And what we need to do is, as an expert and as a legal community and as people, is demand the truth and not stick our necks out wanting this to produce something that it can't produce. Is that
Absolutely
fair?
Yeah. And every country that has done that, believe it or not, the United States is not alone in this matter. The Mayfield case was a turning point in forensic sciences in America. It led to certification requirements. It led to proficiency testing requirements. It led to laboratories becoming accredited, and hiring scientists and people with science backgrounds to do the work. It has done a lot of good. In places like Australia, that preceded, believe it or not, the United States with their turning point. Their turning point was the Azaria Chamberlain case, most famously remembered as the dingo ate my baby case. And junk
that's a
science
Seinfeld episode. I don't know.
I know, but it's actually a real thing.
Oh, really? Okay, educate me. I need to know my Seinfeld.
So, family went camping near Ayers Rock, which is Uluru, that great big rock in the middle of Australia, and they were in a camper van, the classic old, as you might expect from Australia, and the child went missing. The daughter, Azaria, went missing. And someone said they saw a dingo making off with her into the outback. Well, when when the Australian Federal Police went to investigate, they weren't having any of it. And they used some junk science to try and say that the parents actually murdered the child. And, they use some junk science associated with blood and what have you.
Well,
it got debunked. And at the end of the day, it led to changes changes in the Australian system, they became the gold standard for a long time. For their latent fingerprint people to even be able to testify in court, they had to go through a rigorous 5-year study with affiliations with a local university, and that was both in Australia and New Zealand. And essentially, they had the gold standard in the world for years. England had their own thing. They had the Ian Evatt study, which England at the time had a 16-point fingerprint standard, and they gave a number of examiners a whole bunch of different latent fingerprints and asked them to say, well, how many points do you see in each of these fingerprints? Not one examiner saw 15 points.
Well, see, this is the thing about double-blind studies, because you get, and that's how we get error rates, because with double-blind, what they call black box studies, you set a number of fingerprints, you let it, there's control groups, and you can test the efficiency and consistency across time between. And that's what we need to have. To certify, I think there needs to be external testing, and there needs to be a known set of prints, and you give somebody a hold and they say, now match up this and which ones are which. And you can do that externally and accrediting, and that's what is not done on toolmark examiners. But then what happens is a whole little business gets built up around the science. Now, I'm very happy with what fingerprint examiners have done in the way that I think the open book has been done. And one of the big issues, and we talked about it, we touched on it, and I wanted to get back to it, and that is the problem of confirmation bias.
Oh, yeah.
Tell me what confirmation bias is and how that's affected fingerprint analysis.
Well, confirmation bias was always there. We just never understood it. It's not the only bias. There are a ton of biases that affect fingerprint examiners. I might argue that probably the stronger one is situational bias. If you're working on a child murder and you have a latent fingerprint, you might be prepared to make a leap of faith that you wouldn't have done otherwise. And in science, there's no leaps of faith, none. All right, you have to be a stone cold analyst to block out situational bias or situational knowledge if you're unfortunate enough to have it. Confirmation bias, sometimes if it's the bias that sort of forces someone like an examiner to agree with a previously arrived at determination. For example, you got information as a result of an APHIS search. Well, an APHIS search is actually not just a machine, it's also another person. So there's another examiner who's using the APHIS, who encodes it, sends it off for a search, looks at the respondents, makes a determination, passes it along to the examiner that may be the one that goes to court and testifies to it. And they're not going to disagree with somebody who's already arrived at a conclusion. And they're not going to disagree with a computer that says, well, that's him, right? Or if the examiner is a superior officer or a person with some rank in the organization, and you're the subordinate receiving the information, now you have to disagree with this guy who has legitimate authority over you.
Well, and some of the studies have found that this confirmation bias and also contextual bias had quite an impact on a number of error rates that were generating errors.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. See, well, no, I'm going to ask us, maybe this is a stupid question, but are you as the examiner, because like with DNA, you have the officers, they go out and they collect the DNA and then they send it off to the lab, and then the lab person's got code and they just do it and they say, okay, this, and they measure it and they spit back a report. Now here, is the examiner also the person that collects the fingerprints, or
not necessarily?
Not necessarily. So is there a wall between the examiner who is doing the matching and the collection and the crime? Sometimes
yes, sometimes no. Sometimes, you don't live in a bubble. People have seen your work in previous stuff, and they may have heard the chatter from the shop floor about what you do and what you don't do, and they get a sense of who you are professionally. And then, of course, because your reputation gets built up and you become the guy who every time you go to court, they play the March of the Empires. as you walk down the aisle, right? You become that guy, and now you've got to disagree with that guy. And that became, I think that might have been a bit of a factor in the Mayfield case too. They listed a whole bunch of potential errors associated with Mayfield. But at the end of the day, mitigating bias is the trick. And mitigating bias is the only way you can mitigate bias is by documenting your work properly. When you don't document your work, you're exposed.
Well, I'm gonna. Do you ever testify in the United States?
Not in the United States, no. I
Because
typically work Canadian criminal cases and Canadian civil cases.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Daubert standards.
Oh yeah, the Daubert and Fry.
Right. Are you? Do you have? What does Canada use? Do they use something like a Daubert standard?
Yeah, we have Mohan. We have RV, the King versus Regina at the time versus Mohan, Regina versus Abbey. Essentially, the federal rules of evidence that you folks have, Rule 702. I actually really like one of the things that you have in your federal rules of evidence that we don't have, and which our system facilitates the opinion and belief system, whereas your one actually has this wonderful little thing. I'm just going to pull it up here. It says here, a witness who is qualified as an expert by knowledge, skill, experience, training, or education may testify in the form of an opinion otherwise if A, the expert's scientific, technical, or other specialized knowledge will help the trier of fact to understand the evidence to determine the fact in issue. B, the testimony is based on sufficient facts or data. C, the testimony is the product of reliable principles and methods. And D, the expert has reliably applied the principles and methods of the facts of the case. I really like that because it requires your examiner to actually show their work.
Exactly. Right? Well, that's why I'm drilling on this, because I was going to go through with you the Daubert standard, which I applied the Daubert standard to AI and face matching in my law review article here with Dr. Cutler. But I was kind of interested in your opinions as to Daubert as it relates to fingerprints, because I'll read you right from page 121. Fingerprinting, for example, the Daubert factor number one is, has the technique been tested outside of a laboratory? Right. And leading off, here is me citing sources. Fingerprinting, for example, has been extensively tested and verified not only by laboratory conditions, but in actual criminal cases. Therefore, fingerprint testimony is generally admissible.
So I don't know if I agree with that.
Really?
And the reason I
disagree, so tell me more.
The reason I don't know that I agree with that is because it makes the assumption that whoever has come before us has done due diligence and has been able to determine value associated to level 1, level 2, or level 3 features that are used in fingerprint examination. And that just isn't the case. The only thing that they've ever been able to sort of guess value at these reliable and persistent and highly reproducible level 2 features. But you'll find in court cases across the United States, Canada, England, around the world, some examiners, as soon as they get a whiff of level 3 detail, I can see some pores in the friction ridge there. I can see an edge feature that I really like. I can see incipient features in the furrows. I'm going to hang my hat on that. And essentially, currently, there is no reliable way to apply any value to those features. And the reason is simple. They are highly unreproducible. A gentleman, Dr. Cedric Newman, he's moved around a bit in the United States. He's a professor at some university, don't know where right now, but he did a study and found out that they were typically only about 60% reproducible. Well, if you don't have reproducible features, you can't explain dissimilarity. And that's the problem. When 40% of your features don't reproduce, do they not reproduce because they don't exist, or do they not reproduce because of some other factor?
Well, I want to jump ahead because you're tickling a particular question, and this may be a dumb question, maybe a brilliant question. I'll just
there's no dumb questions.
I have no shame, and that is, Okay, so it seems to me one of the differences, for example, between gun projectile matching, you can projectile goes out a barrel and it creates a tool mark, is that there is zero database. There's no database of barrels and bullets that have been fired out for which you can compare. Now, in the fingerprint arena, there are huge databases of fingerprints that are all computerized. So you have a very large sample of fingerprints. Now, my question to you is, has there ever been a study that do they set the supercomputers to the task and say how many of these million fingerprints we have match each other given the similarities?
Yep, they've done that. The FBI black box study, the 50K study, has done just that. And again, it's very much in line with all the other statistical studies on how unlikely or likely, as the case may be, that fingerprints, you'd be able to find two fingerprints from two different donors that are the same, even from the same donor, different
And so
fingers.
what is the answer that the crew wants to know?
The answer is extraordinarily unlikely. And in fact, it's almost astronomical as far as the likelihood. Now, as a scientist, you have to sort of accept the idea that, well, you might be the unlucky person that gets to discover the person that has the same fingerprints as another person.
Now, can you attach a number to that given the large database?
Well, again, because fingerprints are formed as a result of both genetic considerations in the first trimester of life and because certain morphological pressures during growth, as exposed to environment, chemistry, hormones, temperature, all sorts of things during fetal development, genetics plays a part in the development of prints. And so countries that have small populations might have a certain genetic predisposition to certain features, whereas in a more diverse type community, you might get a totally different result. So I'm kind of reluctant to say that a database is going to be the definitive answer, and therefore
I'm just saying that how similar, and the problem is there's so many little questions along the way.
Well, here's the other thing. Yeah, here's
Right.
the other thing is that what a lot of people don't really understand is that fingerprints, the important thing is how you report those results. So when you report, you've done your analysis and you've done your comparison and you're about to report your evaluation, your conclusion, what wording do you use? That's way more important. Because if you're going to say something like the print has been individualized to Joe Smith, well, individualized in the legal term means to the exclusion that anybody who has ever lived, who is living, or whoever will live. And that's just unscientific. It's not possible to even know.
So how do you term it when you testify as to a fingerprint? I mean, and like I have this problem. We get this all the time from Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and somebody, or maybe they have, or there will be people wrongfully convicted over tool mark analysis because these tool mark examiners get up there and say, this bullet is a match to this firearm. And they just cannot say that. That is fake science. And it goes through all the time, and it drives me nuts. And I'm trying to fight against this now. But and part of it, I was like, you can go a long way. You can say this bullet is consistent with being fired from this firearm that was recovered. It's a 32. There's so much you can get without making that extra step, which is unscientific and not verifiable, not falsifiable. So how do you term it when you have very close set of prints that when you're testifying? How do you testify that?
Well, the first thing you have to understand is it's not a black and white decision. There are still organizations and agencies throughout the United States and in Canada that believe in the yes or no answer. In fact, the courts love yes or no answers.
I know they do.
They want simple.
Love it.
Simple.
Juries love it. That's why it's so dangerous.
That's the great thing. So
So answer the question, Shane.
Exactly. Is it yes or no? Well, that's unfortunate that happens because there are cases. In fact, there's a lot of cases where you actually don't know the answer. And the threshold has not been met. The sufficiency, the qualitative, quantitative threshold for a conclusion of any kind has not been met. Do you take a leap of faith and decide which side you want to play for?
But now when you're testifying, let's say you're in court and you're testifying, and you have as definitive as you can go, how is it like that penultimate question before the prosecutor sits down? How is it that you testify? Do you say, it's my opinion that this fingerprint was laid by this particular person? Or how do you frame it so that you go as far as you can and still be honest and valid?
Well, the modern day thing is that you actually follow the guidelines that are produced by a group of people called OSAC. OSAC is essentially an organization that operates under NIST. They've replaced a group called SWIGFAST, and OSAC has come out with wording that talks about the three different types of conclusions that fingerprint examiners should be able to come to. The first one is source identification. You're able to determine the source identification. You could also say source exclusion, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there's also one in the middle called inconclusive lacking support. Now, how you word it, they say source identification is the strongest degree of association between two friction ridge impressions. It is the conclusion that the observations provide extremely strong support for the proposition that the impressions originated from the same source, and extremely weak support for the proposition that they originated from different sources. Source identification is reached when the friction ridge impressions have corresponding ridge detail, and the examiner would not expect to see the same arrangement of details repeated in an impression that came from a different source. And then you would go on and say, well, the latent R1 and the right middle fingerprint of Joe Smith have corresponding friction ridge detail. The observed correspondence offers substantially stronger support that the two impressions were made by the same source than by different sources. It is my opinion that the latent print, or whatever it was made by the middle finger of Joe Smith. That's how you would report in source identification.
That's fair. I don't, none of that stuff that you just said, if you were properly Daubert qualified.
That's not how it was. That's not how it's always been done.
I understand that, but it's, as a defense attorney, I'm not objecting to what you're saying there.
Because
it's careful, it's precise, and it's a lot of gobbledygook, a lot of science. But, people want to hear the, he did it, right? But the thing is that you're being very careful, and I appreciate that. I want to pause for a second because we have a Rumble rant, and of course, I always respond to my Rumble rants, especially from the great Matt himself, who actually is a good guy, and he says, "Wait, Steve, you forgot to go through his fully elaborated CV. How can we qualify as an expert?" Okay, and see, that's the thing, because I tell people, when people start going through the CV on trials, we cover trials on these Rumble channels and stuff. When that's the time to go to the bathroom, because it's basically pointless drivel. Now, I know that you work very hard for that, and I don't want to disrespect it. So if they want to find out more about Shane Turnidge? Shane Turnidge, where would they go to find out, and what service? Do you provide private service, or you work for the government? What is your role?
I'm for hire. That's at this point in my time, I'm retired. I no longer work for the police services that I once worked for. I work as a private independent fingerprint examiner. I have been hired by criminal defense attorneys across Canada. I have been hired by private citizens across Canada. I've done art verification work. Some guy bought a chair that he swore was painted by Pablo Picasso, and he felt there was a fingerprint in the paint, and he wanted me to compare the fingerprint to how somehow he had fingerprints from Pablo Picasso.
So how would they get in touch with you if they want to employ
how you get in touch with me is www.sstforensics.com. And you've got my email address there, my phone number, should you feel the need. I send CVs out.
Services, and honest experts are golden. And this is what dealing with, and I love them when they're great, and I hate it when they're wrong. And we deal with this all the time in criminal defense work. So I really appreciate your approach. Let me go through a little more things. I've got a list here, and I don't know how much time you have, but I have so many good questions for you. And okay, let's talk about which way to go. Proficiency testing. Okay, proficiency testing is, what you talking about, which is fascinating about this area of expertise, because you are ultimately forming a subjective opinion based on a lot of formalized science and a lot of data and a lot of collection. There's so many factors, but then ultimately you as the expert are forming the opinion, and that opinion is an educated opinion by training and by following certain procedures and sciences. So what sort of proficiency in training is there, and what sort of outside standards are projected into the profession of fingerprint analysis?
I wish I had a better opinion of proficiency testing, because it sounds like a utopian solution to a problem of trying to weed out the weeds in the garden, as it were. The problem is, I also know how government works. And unfortunately, the bar is low. And so if I want people to pass if I want people to pass consistently a proficiency test, I can design a test that's exactly what will happen. I can also design one that will fail. And in fact, on my LinkedIn profile, I actually put up a really nasty example of that. And it's because ACE-V does have limits and thresholds. Fingerprint examination is about limits and thresholds. Lawyers come to court and they say, how many points have you got? And, the second generation fingerprint examiners, the belief opinion guys, won't answer the question. I used to say 15 points. And then the head would go in the hands and the plea deal would happen on the side, kind of thing. But at the end of the day, lawyers don't ask the right questions at the right time. How many points you got? Well, I would say to you, well, when do you want me to report those points? Because there's actually two stages in the ACE-V process where that's relevant. Number one, suitability for the latent print. You're trying to determine the utility of the latent print. Well, how many points are there in the latent print that you found? All right. So now you want to know about the strength of the actual seen evidence. Then you do a comparison after it's all said and done. And now you're looking for points that are in sequence, in agreement between the two impressions, the latent print impression and the known print impression. Well, that is more relevant as far as the conclusion is concerned, but it's not necessarily conclusive, because you might also want to find out, were there any dissimilarities? Dissimilarities happen, especially in this day and age. This day and age, we wrestle. Latent print examiners absolutely detest live scan prints. And the reason, because live scan occasionally introduces things called optical artifacts. Optical artifacts are...
Explain what live scan prints are first, though.
Live scan prints are electronically recorded fingerprints. So fingerprints are placed on a scanner, and they're captured into a computer system and then used for as a record. Usually states do that, countries do that, civil systems exist for that sort of purpose, Department of Defense, so on and so forth. It's a nice, easy way of keeping your criminals clean. That's my theory, because you're not necessarily putting ink on their hands and transferring that ink to a piece of paper, which is real evidence. Instead, you have now digital evidence and documented evidence. It introduces all kinds of problems when you're doing comparisons. And if you have dissimilarities in a comparison that was caused by the live scan, you have to be able to explain that. And unfortunately, what LiveScan tends to do is it tends to clean up the evidence that might have explained the artifacts, because there's an image processing subroutine that goes behind it.
Well, now, see, this goes back to the source material that we talked about to begin with, is that how you collect these things can have an effect on reliability. So, same with face recognition. A person in the dark with their hoodie up like this, it's different than somebody who's doing a full face, like, photo lineup. Those are very different images and have very different values and different evidentiary values. So I'm sure when you go to a crime scene, you might collect a half a palm print. And so there's a lot left off. I wanted to ask about this because I know there's been this big trial that's been the Zachariah Anderson trial. I didn't follow it, but a lot of people in the chats who watch me are familiar with that. And basically, the consensus of the people that watched it are believe that he was wrongfully convicted. And one of the issues in that case, and I wanted to pass it by you just to hear what your thoughts are, is that they came into the crime scene. Supposedly it was a murder that happened in a particular room. And the police agencies basically did no fingerprint collection at all on any of like the doorknobs or anything. Where, how would you approach, when you approach a crime scene, how do you analyze it for where fingerprints of evidentiary value might be located?
Well, crime scene processing is not my specialty. I'm going to be full disclosure on that. I'm an analyst, but that doesn't mean to say I don't really understand what a crime scene person would do. Given the severity of the crime, you do everything. All right. And it's not like it's a shoplifting or an attempt to break and enter. If it's going to be a homicide, if it's going to be a sexual assault or some sort of major crime, you're going full bore. And at least that was the way it once was. Now I've been out of law enforcement for, 6.5 years at this point. Things might have changed, but I don't think so.
No. Well, when you have a murder, you have, the full resources. Usually that's the maximum state process. They bring in the state agencies. There's processes that are engaged when there's a murder scene that don't exist in, say, a petty theft or something like that.
You don't. I tell you, any crime scene person, any crime scene processor that is questioning themselves whether or not they should have done it or they ought to do it, they should just do it. That's been my mantra from day one. I can remember a major
case. This is a perfect
case.
setup. I'm glad you brought this up, and I know that people would be upset with me if I didn't promote my new book, only available at stevegosney.com, which is called Death Penalty Debates: a net positive or net negative. That's the book title, and it's available at Steve. And one of the questions that's answered is, why does the death penalty cost so much? And there's a cost question related to the death penalty. And I seek to explain that because I'm a death penalty qualified appellate attorney. And it's because maximum effort is put in by the state in solving those crimes. And when they do that, that generates a concomitant burden back on the defense to analyze the evidence that was collected in those murder scenes. That's just one of the primary. So it kind of relates to your point. When you have a murder, all of a sudden you have, and that's available for pre-order, by the way. And it's sending it to the printer on Monday. So you guys got to go and get stevegosney.com. Go buy my new book. So that was a plug. So I got you there. And I know you said that wasn't your area, but we've made that point that you do have extraordinary resources in murder crime scenes. I want to ask you a few more things because I really, people that are interested, we have a lot of people. Flux, haven't seen Flux. Where's Flux? She's always interested in this forensic science stuff, as am I. I'm always learning, and I like learning from you. And I always go back to PCAST, and that's the September 2016 President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. And I'd like you to react and update me, because this was 2016 and a lot of technology has happened since then, and I would like your response to each of these three conclusions. Would you be able to do that?
Sure.
Okay, let's try this one. So number one conclusion related to latent fingerprint analysis was, the studies collectively demonstrate that many examiners can, under some circumstances, produce correct answers at some level of accuracy. Do you still think, does that hold water today still, or is it stronger now?
Wow. That's a tough one, because really I've seen a very diverse set of skills in the cases that I that I review across Canada. 2 years ago, I actually found a false positive conclusion in casework. And it was a latent print with 27 points. And they falsely identified this particular individual. Is not only was it falsely identified, it was falsely verified. And I got disclosure the day before the trial.
Oh, man.
When I called the lawyer while he was driving to court that morning and said, the latent print does not belong to your client, he goes, "What? That doesn't happen." I said, "Well, it just did."
Well, this is exactly why. And see, you're in private practice. We lawyers need to hear what you're saying, because what happens is I think there's too much faith put in fingerprints to the fact that, well, the FDLE said it's the match, and I'm just going to leave it at that. When I think that you need to question the science. And so I deal with the homicide team, the death penalty teams, and having an independent expert review the work of the departments is very important. And that's where you come in. And that's why defense attorneys need to be aware that it's not a settled science. There's opinion and there's room for error.
It's not black and white. And there's incredible levels of nuance. There's incredible levels of discrimination, and there are also very poorly understood values that are placed on certain features that people see in these prints. And some people improperly place too much value in the wrong place. And this is the reason why some of these things kind of go sideways. In the Mayfield case that you've talked about, if you looked at the print of Daoud versus Brandon Mayfield, you'd see a lot of similarity in the shape. However, the devil's in the details. And unfortunately, when you have a yes or no, black or white, on or off type system, you're causing people to make those leaps of faith. And I say, and I stand by it. In the belief opinion system, you can't show what you did. The system I advocate for is, listen, I say, don't take my word for it. Here's the data. I'm showing you everything I've done. It's my opinion based on that data that this is.
Having an independent expert to come and look at that work and follow it along and say, okay, for example, the error could be in the sample collection, the way it was collected, the quality of the sample. It could come in the database that they're using. It could come in confirmation bias. It could come in the opinion. There's so many errors along the way, and having somebody with an expert eye.
It can also be a nefarious act by
I was going to get there. Okay, we'll save that for a second. We'll end.
And I have participated in such a thing.
Okay, well, hopefully on the right side.
Yes, absolutely.
Let's see. Okay, here's conclusion number 2 of the PCAST report from 2016. I want you to update me for some reason here. Let's see. The empirically estimated false positive rates are much higher than the general public, and by extension, most jurors would likely believe based on longstanding claims about the accuracy of fingerprint analysis.
I agree.
Yeah, that's right out of the president's. Explain what PCAST is, because you're familiar with this report.
Well, it is an American thing, so you'll forgive me if I'm not as knowledgeable.
I can do it if you want. If you don't,
if you could do it, it'd probably be better. I do remember glossing over it, and I remember
it is really it's very much a scientific validity assessment. It was a president's council that was appointing scientists, real scientists, to analyze the forensic sciences. So it's the title of it was Forensic Science in Criminal Courts, ensuring scientific validity of feature comparison methods. So this was a top to bottom analysis on the forensics and how much of it is science and how much of it is faux science. And like, for example, the bite marks are faux science. Tool mark examination, firearm matching techniques, faux science. Fingerprints were not condemned that way. Fingerprints were saying we need more studies, there needs to be controls, and it's a fascinating read. I read through the whole thing on the fingerprint section today. It's a really neat read, and I like good science. I want science to help, right? But we have to be careful. And what the point that they were making, though, is it's not DNA. There is an opinion. No. There's a lot of error. There is built in, and it needs to be understood in context. And in fact, I even sent out an email. See, this stuff helps me in my job. I sent an email out to all of our trial attorneys that if you have a fingerprint case, that we could even draft a special instruction to address that there are error rates that you need to be aware of. It's not what you think it is. So you agree with point 2, then that's still valid as a conclusion.
Yeah, I think it is.
Let's do point 3, okay? Of the 2, and this one is one that you maybe need to update me on. Of the 2 appropriately designed black box studies, the larger study, which was the FBI 2011 study, yielded a false positive rate that is unlikely to exceed 1 in 306 conclusive examinations, while the other, Miami-Dade 2014, yielded a considerably higher false positive rate of 1 in 18. The earlier studies, which were not designed as validation studies, also yielded high false positives. So have there been other black box studies since this time that have yielded some error rates that you can report?
Other black box studies, no. But again, I think those black box studies suffer from systemic issues. And it could be a representation of training in those specific locations. It could be a representation of experience, turnover, mentoring, the type of training that they're getting. Are they being trained by dinosaurs who are still committed to the old ways? There are some people that will admit that they just can't change. That's how they were trained, and those are the train tracks they're on. And so they pass that same ideology down to the next generation. And so you get a mix of people that understand or a little better at understanding data, and you get a mix of people that are more interested in the ego side of things with respect to their opinion and their inflated.
Well, and this is where you came in with your comment that intrigued me. Is that this is a subjective opinion that can be fortified by training, and there is scientific validity behind it. But there is also an element of an art that can be improved by training. But you really do need to be able to show your work, and it needs to be double checked. And it is not as clean, it is not as certain as, say, a DNA test is, which is much more, much stronger scientific validity, but it's also not faux science. Is that
exactly
fair? Okay.
Yes, there are. But the other thing is too that there's all these reports and things that come down the pipe. But how long would it take for those reports to actually get implemented on the shop floor? So a group of scientists get together in Washington, Ottawa, London, and they come up with a great plan, and they come up with some great ideas, and they publish a piece of paper, and then the police colleges and the training facilities get that information, and sometimes they go, yeah, whatever, I'll wait for the next one. And so that information doesn't get passed along the same way. I can think of an actual paper that I really like, that I think really does a great job at getting to the humanity element.
Could you cite that paper for?
Yep, I'll even send it to you. It's called Latent Print Examination and Human Factors, Improving the Practice Through a Systems Approach, the report of the Expert Working Group on Human Factors in Latent Print Analysis. And that was put out in February 2012 by NIST.
Would you send that to me?
I will.
Love to read that.
I think you will find that incredibly enlightening. And it shows you everything that you need to understand about the type of environments that people work in, how that environment contributes to errors. And so some environments may be more prone to error, and so their black box study may illustrate that.
And that's what I think, I forget which study it was, but the PCAST report talked about it. About some of these were internal reports; they weren't externally reported.
And they might have been whitewashed as well.
Right. So we need to be careful about what we're relying on. And there's a lot of, but there is some efforts. I mean, like I said, it's an interesting exam, and this is I'm learning a lot, and I'm enjoying this tremendously. But I do want to take a second and a break, because one thing we didn't do is recognize all of our great chatters. And I'm a chat fan. And so I just want to give some yell outs to, like, a job well done. I see Rose is here. Rose RN RNC. Fedor Roski is here. Matt himself, we mentioned earlier, he gave a nice super chat. Winter Soldier, Donut Mind Me. Let's see who else is here. All my buddies. These are all my. Oh, Danny 7277. Hi, Danny. I just want to make sure we don't forget anybody. That's on our Rumble. Mimi was here earlier. She's been kind of quiet. Maybe they're listening. Nexit 2023. Oh, I was there. I was in the chat. So that's our Rumblers, and in our YouTubers, we've got Trish Norman, and let's see who else we have here. A lot of nice folks. Well, Glitter Fart. We got an expert here. How dare you say such things? And I'm sure he's never heard such words. Trish Norman, thank you. And let's see who else we got. So the Glitter, you've really been piling it on here on the chat. Good for you. I love chats. So that's our those are our chat funks. Dominant T1. I don't know if there's any new. Soulless Ginger was here. Mimi, are you still here? You're over on both sides. Anyways, a lot of people in the chat, so I wanted to say hello to them. Now, let's transition, and I want to transition out with some final questions, but the first one is, where we've talked about the science, we've talked about the validity and the problems and the strengths, but let's talk about the ultimate human factor, and that is corruption. Ultimately, the evil that's within man, and one of those things is that we're going to get our man and we're going to falsify. Where have you seen corruption, and do you have a story that you can share?
Oh, there's lots of corruption. When I see something that says all cops are amazing, I sort of hold my breath, and I usually keep my mouth shut. Because
you were a former badge. Now, come on.
No, I was a civilian employee. Civilian employee for both.
Well, you won't find that amongst my chats. I mean, we're pretty balanced here. I've got the best chat in the world, so you don't need to apologize for the line.
At the end of the day, what I found is that police officers are people, and the police officers tend to have alpha characteristics, some personality. How I survived is I'm not an alpha. I'm actually a sigma, which means I really don't care what they think. And so at the end of the day, I'm the ultimate punk rocker, the outlier. And I just did my job. And I observed, I watched, and I saw incredible levels of corruption and just, things that you would just not think you would do,
which gives
making the money.
When you see these results, you have to say, wait a second, you got to look at it with a very skeptical eye and double check and triple check.
I had a very good friend in the United States. I'm not going to tell you where, because out of respect for him. He contacted me while I was working as in law enforcement, and he said, Shane, he goes, something doesn't smell right about this case. And he showed me a latent print. The latent print was what we call a takeaway print. And so the takeaway print, essentially what happens is if there's a matrix, if there's some sort of a substance on a surface, and you put your digit on the surface, and then you lift your digit off the surface, you've carried the matrix on your digit, and you've left a void in the matrix on the surface. Well, the scene card suggested that this was found on a coffee table, a glass coffee table, and that you should run this through the APHIS to see if this is a known subject or something like that. So this was a break and enter. And something didn't seem right to him, right? So he wanted a second opinion. I absolutely agreed with him. And then I did a little work in Photoshop. And what I did was I inverted the image, and I realized exactly what it was. This was a small detachment, I'm not going to say where they used to take fingerprints with ink and paper. And so to do that, the process is you put some India ink on a glass platen, you grab a roller, you roll it out, nice thin matrix, and then you press the person's finger down on the glass platen and you roll it side to side. and then you transfer that to a piece of paper. What happens is, on the glass platen, you now have a void, and you still have the ink matrix surrounding the actual fingerprints, the takeaway impression. I told my friend, I said, what you've got there is a guy who has taken fingerprint tape. He's taken a set of fingerprints, charging somebody with some sort of a crime. He's taken fingerprint tape, placed it over on the ink platen, transferred it to tape, put it on a backing card, and said he found it at a crime scene, when in fact it was from the booking hall.
Wow, unbelievable. That's really terrible.
But that's reality.
Yeah, well, and I understand, and it gets. I used to train police officers when I was in the prosecutor's office, and I remember they'd come in, and sometimes I had a couple people that would come in. They'd say, "Well, before the deposition, they'd want to meet with me," and I'd say, "Okay, come on in." And they'd say, "Well, what do you want me to say?" And I'd say, "Well, just say the truth, right? You were there. Just tell them what happened. You know what? I'm not telling you what to say, but I think it's such a desire. Like, I know he did it, and so I'm going to create facts and evidence that all of a sudden becomes the case, and it's very, very insidious, and we need to lean against that, and that's why
some of the other justification is that I know this guy's done other crimes,
right?
And I'm sure we didn't get him for all those other ones. We're going to get him for this one, and because who does one break and enter, for example, right?
Right. Well, and there are bad guys, but ultimately we have a system, and you don't debase yourself and debase your honesty. You are injecting fraud and lies and into a system, and ultimately, aren't you also letting somebody who did do it get away with it?
Well, when you wear the white hat, you have to accept that there's going to be times when you don't get the win.
Right.
But you wear the white hat. And
well, this is like I say, people are almost, not all crimes are solvable. Sometimes you have a crime that's almost solved. And that you're going to have a lot of crimes like that when you have a beyond the reasonable doubt standard. And we need to be comfortable to understand that we don't know everything. We are humans and we are limited. Let me ask you a couple more questions. One is, can you extract DNA from fingerprints?
They're leaning towards yes on that. They're leaning towards yes. Again, now these wonderful ethereal ideas are awesome, except that the person who's actually doing the work is likely going to say, yeah, whatever. Like I've got time to do that. Right. And why am I going to ruin a perfectly good fingerprint when I could maybe get the quick win, which is the reason that fingerprints are actually in the realm of law enforcement in the first place. Very few universities actually teach friction ridge examination, which is why I do, because I'm absolutely driven to try and educate not just law enforcement, but also criminal defense lawyers, people who have a general interest in it, people that want to get into forensic departments, that are working for a police department now, that maybe want to make that move, but I can teach them the right way. In fact, I do. I run classes, and I also have an online course that's off my website.
Okay, and so where would they go to get that? Rose is in the chat. I see. She's one of my mods. Can you post Shane's contact information? So you mostly work in Canada, right?
I mostly work in Canada,
if somebody
but online.
Paid you enough, you'd probably come to the United States.
Yeah, I probably would. I mean,
but mostly Canada.
I mostly go to the U.S. for fun.
Come to Florida. You come down to Florida. Come to Daytona.
I go to every cruise port in Florida. You name it. But I also I live very close to Michigan. I'm actually only literally 9 miles from the border. Excellent. And so it's I enjoy it. I enjoy the people in the United States. I enjoy. There's a lot of things I really enjoy. I switch off the politics.
Right. Well, actually, but we won't get into that. Let me ask you one more thing, and that is that I'm not the greatest interviewer. I'm doing my best, and so I want to leave it in your hands. What is it? Something I didn't ask you that I should have asked you? There's something that you really need to share that we haven't yet covered. That's really important.
Don't assume that you understand the fingerprint examination process from A to Z. And and the nuances associated with it. Seek out that information. Seek out the most current information you can, because it's the most relevant, because we're moving from that dogma to that belief to now we're moving closer to science. We're not fully into science yet, but we're getting closer. I think people that are practicing this craft need to turn down the volume. Unfortunately, Spinal Tap, turn it to 11 doesn't work when you're a fingerprint examiner. You need to go at maybe 5. And the reason for that is less is usually more. When you present honestly and truthfully, and when you can speak truth to power, you're a better witness. You're a more effective witness. And in a courtroom, what examiners think the judge thinks of them is usually wrong.
Right.
The judge usually sits there and rolls their eyes, if they're not asleep, and might, especially in Canada, we have appointed judges. They listen to this stuff all the time, and I can understand why they would get turned off. But you have to speak what you can, and when you can't answer a question, you just state that.
Right. Well, and that's a matter, you have to approach these things, I think, with humility.
Yes.
And this is that going things with humble, it's like not knowing and saying, I don't know, is a valid answer. But people get their egos all wrapped up into it, and they think they want to win, when instead we should look for truth, and we should try to do our best and bring each other up. So
embracing subjectivity is a very important part of it. Understanding that just because you say it doesn't necessarily make it true.
And then you get invested in this opinion to the point that, like, I'd rather be right and an innocent person go to prison. No, I'm here and I'm going to throw it out there and do the best I can, but understand that I'm a limited human being with biases and everything else. And I'm just going to do the best that I can. And that's all we can strive to do, is do the best we can. And you seem like my kind of guy, which is the kind of guy that you do have some humility, a little bit, and you try to do the best, and you come to Florida and go on cruise ships, support our Florida economy. Absolutely. So I want to thank you for your time.
Absolutely, Steve.
And it's been a pleasure. I will tell everybody, tomorrow at 10 p.m., I will be on Arthur Nix's channel. I don't even know how to find him. He asked me on, and I'm going to talk music, all of my music career, which are stories that people haven't heard before about my earlier music career when I was a rock and roll musician. I played the Roxy Theater in LA, showcased the Roxy back in the 80s when I was in a hair metal band. So you can hear more about that tomorrow night at 10 o'clock with Arthur Nix, N-I-X. I don't know. I think he's got a relatively new channel and asked me on. So Matt himself, thank you very much for the Rumble rant. He says, Shane has been a great guest, great in all caps. Looking forward to hearing from him more. Well, we'll see. I mean, you're probably going to get more bites. This has just been meat and substance. You know what I'm going to do is I'm going to share this with some of my defense attorney friends, and we're going to all watch and learn, because this is a learning opportunity for me. And
that's what I do. I teach people what the process is truly about and take the mystery out of it, because it doesn't have to be shrouded. It doesn't have to be held behind law enforcement. This needs to get to universities.
I mean, this is a public prosecution or public.
Absolutely.
Putting somebody in prison for years and years and years. It needs to be an open process, and it needs to be thoroughly examined, and we need to be very careful what we're doing.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, well, maybe we'll bring you back and we'll talk some 80s music, because you've got Helix connections and Triumph and Rush.
But I like the classic alternatives, though. That's me.
What's your favorite band right now?
Right now? This is going to shock a lot of viewers. Depeche Mode.
Hey, yeah. Yes.
I love Depeche Mode.
Yeah, I love Depeche Mode too. A very good choice, actually. I'm impressed. See, they're good stuff. All right. Well, thank you very much, and we'll have a good night. You can just hang out for a second. We'll shut down the broadcast. Thanks, everybody. I know everybody went right out and bought my death penalty book at stevegosney.com, and I'm sure I had lots of sales. So thanks a lot, and great guest, Shane. And we'll see you tomorrow. See you soon. All right.